Kia ora koutou. Ko Turamoe te maunga, ko Northern Wairoa te awa, no Takiwera ahau, me ki Dargaville. Ko Southern Cross te waka, ko Tauiwi te iwi, no Ingarangi tōku whānau, ko Wendy Allison tōku ingoa. Nō reira, he mihi nunui ki te reo o te whenua, ki te reo o te moana, koutou o ngā hau e whā, tino harikoa te ngākau o tēnei, ko Aotearoa tōku kāinga I nāianei. Tēnā koutou, kia ora ngā tātou. Hi, I'm Wendy Allison, Managing Director of Know Your Stuff. We go to music festivals and test people's drugs for them to help them make more informed choices. We've been doing this for 7 years now, and it's pretty clear that drug checking reduces drug harm. So I've been asked here today to talk about stigma as a barrier to harm reduction. When I was asked to do this, I thought to myself, what can I possibly have to say about stigma? As we've been hearing, stigma mostly affects people who are already vulnerable and already marginalised. I'm white, middle class, educated, employed, able-bodied, and the director of an organisation that caters to people who are mostly like me. I thought, who am I to talk about stigma? But then I started thinking about the impacts of stigma on our clients, on our service, and on our community, and I realised that I do have something to say, so here goes. It's true that vulnerable and marginalised people are much more seriously affected. Let's just get that out there right now. But if we want to end stigma, we need to recognise that it affects all of us. The impacts are different, the barriers are different, but the self-reinforcing nature of stigmatised beliefs about drug users pervade all levels of society, and the silence of the privileged only perpetuates that. I want to talk about that silence. So, at its root, stigma is immature black and white thinking that divides the world into good and bad, people who don't use drugs and addicts. This creates an assumption that any drug use is problematic and will inevitably lead to harm. This ignores almost all drug users, those people who use drugs sometimes and are mostly responsible, sometimes not, and who are rarely, if ever, harmed by their use. If we ignore the existence of these people in the middle, we're falling into the same kind of black and white thinking and perpetuating stigma by focusing only on the worst outcomes. Conveniently, stigma itself makes these people very easy to ignore. So, I'm going to do a quick exercise. Let's have a show of hands. Anyone who's a regular illicit drug user, stick your hand up. 13 to 18% is what it says in the statistics. And what this tells me is there's a whole bunch of people in this room who are hiding something. So, as we just illustrated, one of the biggest impacts of stigma on those people in the middle is to remove their voice from the discussion and render them invisible. How do we do that? Well, let's have a look. This is a small selection of things I've seen said on the internet about drug users in the last couple of weeks. These are beliefs that people are happy to share publicly, and they are everywhere. I was recently part of a drug awareness seminar for bar owners in which one of the other speakers, who was a bar security expert, recommended coating the surfaces of bars with CRC to prevent people from snorting drugs off them. When this was pointed out as potentially dangerous, his response was, well, they've chosen to use illicit drugs, that's natural selection. And this room full of responsible hosts, community constables, and alcohol and other drug workers laughed. I thought, nice to know people are being taught that drug users dying is funny. Okay, this is a picture of part of a rental home application that was shown to me recently. A third of the questions are about drugs. They are all compulsory, and I'm wondering how likely it is that anyone who admitted that they're a drug user would get that property. This one illustrates the assumption that drug users are inherently untrustworthy, which allows us to ignore and dismiss harm done to them by others. Or worse, to accept this type of assault as a logical consequence of drug use. Last year, I refused a pre-employment drug test on principle because, as someone with expertise on the impacts of drug policy, I will not support that practice. I explained my reasons to the company, and I offered to have a frank conversation with them about any concerns they might have. Here's their response. No discussion, no flexibility, pee in a cup or we cut you. I refuse to be coerced, but many people don't have that privilege, and we keep getting to pretend that we're keeping our workforce drug-free. This story is from someone who publicly identifies as a drug user because their goal is to destigmatise drug use and challenge people's perceptions of who we consider to be a drug user. In this case, the caseworker was convinced that the allegations were fraudulent and this woman got to keep her children. But it's a very good example of how stigma can be weaponised against people, and many victims of this are not so lucky. So, is it any wonder then that people don't talk about their drug use? We brag that we don't care about drug users' well-being. We make them vulnerable to losing their home, their children, their employment, not because their drug use is problematic, but because society is convinced that they are problematic. And then we go, see, all drug use is problematic. It's even hardwired into the wording of our drug laws. According to the Misuse of Drugs Act, all use is misuse. Even just having a controlled drug in your pocket is misuse. And that makes you a criminal and undesirable, a problem. So, you might want to know, how is the stigma a barrier to harm reduction? Well, for Know Your Stuff and its clients, it comes in a few forms. Our clients tell us that until they come and see us, they have never had a non-judgmental conversation about drugs, so they just don't talk about drugs. As a result, they have no practical strategies to keep themselves safe. Some people are even afraid to come and see us in case it's a trap or someone they know sees them and tells the wrong people. People do end up having problems when taking drugs. Their drug use is treated as a bigger issue than their actual problems. Sometimes, like this person, they are dismissed altogether by medical professionals with stigma-based ideas. It took 5 years of us busting our guts, spending our own money and time, and collecting data meticulously to even get the attention of the government, only to be told that our data couldn't possibly be objective and more research is needed. The government then spent $60,000 on a report from Victoria University that doesn't say anything we couldn't tell you already. Opponents of drug checking were able to fearmonger using unsubstantiated notions of encouraging use and sending the wrong message, and these were accepted as legitimate even in the face of 20 years of actual evidence that this doesn't happen. And just quietly, that's Derek Ball. I was very happy thinking of him packing up his stuff and going away. Okay. David Seymour, before arguing in support of drug checking, felt the need to disclaim at length that he is not a drug user, to tell us all how grateful he is that he is not a drug user, that it's not something he understands, not something he condones, and not something he supports, because heaven forbid someone who actually does know, does understand, and does support drug users gets to have any say in whether or not they have access to harm reduction services. Yeah. There's the part where a significant number of people would rather the public continue to pay indefinitely for the hospitalisation of young people, but not for drug checking, which kept scores of young people out of hospital this New Year's. And finally, there's the one where the government keeps ignoring expert advice to stop criminalising and harming drug users with laws that don't work. It's a decade now since the Law Commission report recommended the Misuse of Drugs Act be repealed and replaced by an act administered by the Ministry of Health. This is the single most effective thing the most powerful people in Aotearoa could do to reduce drug harm. Yet successive governments have failed to act on those recommendations, instead so fearing the backlash from voters due to the stigma that they themselves created, that they'd rather see people continue to be made vulnerable, excluded, harmed, punished and killed than take the risk of admitting they were wrong. The effects of stigma on harm reduction resonate all the way from our clients to the most powerful people in the country. And now we have another government, one with a pretty good record of talking about health and wellbeing and a voter mandate to act alone. And this government too is stalling and putting up barriers by saying they won't review the Misuse of Drugs Act without more evidence and more support. I would suggest that this government is shaping up to be another victim of its own stigma. And I would ask them, as was asked of the previous government 4 years ago, how much evidence is enough? I spoke here 4 years ago, At that time, Know Your Stuff was a plucky little grassroots organisation that was dodging around the law and only just starting to get attention for our work. Now we have legal standing. We're pretty stoked about that. And the government has had international acclaim for it. They seem quite happy to take the credit. But apart from the early warning system, the Misuse of Drugs Amendment Act, and a couple of drug reclassifications to make punishments more harsh, nothing much else has changed. We are not willing to be used by the government to show everyone how progressive they are. In fact, I would suggest that tutuing about with the Misuse of Drugs Act in a way that makes privileged people safer while not helping anybody else is actually pretty conservative. And we deserve better. So, what can we do about that? One thing I've learnt from the Know Your Stuff project is the power of ethical non-compliance, and that privileged nobodies like me can make things happen if they have the courage. We need to use that privilege to get on with doing the things that help the people in our communities who need it, whether the government approves or not. That's what the Needle Exchange did in the 1980s. It's what Know Your Stuff has done, and it's what the Green Fairies are doing. And if you're in a position of privilege, then it's what you should do too. Because vulnerable people die while privileged people wait around for government approval. We also need to put effort into changing the narrative. Remember the statistic at the beginning of this talk, about 13 to 16% of people who use drugs regularly? That's roughly 1 in 8. I think about that figure a lot when I'm at work, in business meetings, in the supermarket, visiting ministries, and when I think about the 120 seats in Parliament. 1 in 8. There are so many drug users in places of power, and we don't see it because they are silenced by fear that if they are exposed, the stigma attached to drug use will become attached to them. This perpetuates a skewed view of who uses drugs. Dr. Carl Hart, in his recent book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, urges drug users who can socially afford to come out of the closet as a form of mass protest. I'm aware that most people aren't in the position to take that risk, but if you are, if you're exposing yourself to that stigma won't ruin your life, I encourage you to do so, even if it's only to those close to you. Change their view. Let them change someone else's. And if we can't do that, we can make the current narrative less comfortable. We can stop accepting the statement that more evidence is needed. It's not. We have nearly 50 years of evidence that prohibition has failed and that harm reduction works. We can draw attention to the overgrown propaganda about the harms of drug use. Wastewater monitoring results from last year tell us that between July and September, Kiwis were taking around 78,000 doses of MDMA per week. MDMA is classified as high risk. If it's that high risk, why are our health services not overflowing with MDMA users every week? Or methamphetamine, classified as very high risk of harm. Meth harm, according to the Drug Harm Index, is primarily associated with problematic dependent use. The same report estimates that only around 5% of methamphetamine users are dependent. By contrast, let's compare meth with our beloved national sport. There are around 1,000 ACC claims per week made for rugby-related injuries. Nearly 30% of rugby players can expect to get hurt, and in the youth category, that's 50%. Our country has been spending 20 times more taxpayer dollars fixing broken rugby players than it has helping amphetamine users. There are an estimated 300 to 500,000 drug users in Aotearoa. Drug use is more normal than playing rugby and less costly to our health system. We need to stop letting the government, the media, and other members of the public get away with the baseless lie that drug use inevitably leads to harm. We need to stop quietly accepting the constant daily violation of the rights and bodily autonomy of people who use drugs. We need to stop allowing the government to wring its hands about condoning drug use and take it to task about condoning harmful, racially biased and stigmatising policies. We need to stop acting as if problems with drugs are somehow worse than other problems and the people who have them less deserving of help. We need to change the narrative to one that recognises that drug use is normal and it's drug harm that is not. It is this understanding of the normality of drug use that underpins Know Your Stuff's effectiveness. In an environment without judgment, stigma can't thrive, and in the absence of stigma, we create space for real, honest conversations about drugs with our clients. Without stigma, we'd be able to have real, honest conversations about drugs as a country. We'd be able to take a hard look at the actual drivers behind problematic drug use: inequality, disconnection, trauma. We'd be able to talk about what actually works to reduce drug harm instead of always focusing on use and, by extension, users. And if we care about reducing harm, it's our duty to make that happen. At the start of this talk, in my pepeha, I acknowledged the languages of the land and the languages of the sea, the stories of all the people of Aotearoa. We need to not just hear those voices, we need to make space for those voices in the absence of stigma, and that includes the ones in languages that we don't normally hear, the stories of the dispossessed, the marginalised, and the silenced. The best thing privileged people can do about stigma is to refuse to be silenced by it, instead to raise our voices, to encourage understanding that drug use is normal, because it is normal. We need to speak up and start having honest conversations with friends, with our colleagues, and with our elected officials. And for those elected officials in the room that actually hung around this long, in case you missed it, you need to repeal the Misuse of Drugs Act. Thank you.